Well, Christianity has an extraordinarily long history in England, and it goes right back to the very early Roman times. Just to remind people that the Romans invaded what was then Britannia, became the Roman province of Britannia. It was invaded in 43 AD. That's obviously just a few years after the crucifixion. So Christianity was starting to appear around the Roman Empire at this very time. Britain had a very long history of trading with the Mediterranean region well before the Romans arrived, particularly tin and other metals that were mined in places like Cornwall and Devon were sent round to the Mediterranean. There's centuries of history of that. So stories that go back into ancient British history about Christ actually making a journey to England in his early years, a period that's not really recorded in the New Testament. It's quite a long period when he was in his late teens, early 20s, when it's quite feasible that he travelled. And the stories are that he travelled with his uncle, who was Joseph of Arimathea, who was indeed a metals trader who almost certainly dealt with metals mined in southern England. So this myth or legend has gone throughout English history, and it's fascinating because there is no other nation that has a similar sort of record of this type of appearance having been made before. The Romans took up Christianity, and in the 4th century, it became the established religion for the Roman Empire. So it existed in Britain for a number of centuries before that point, but then it became mainstream. But soon after that, the Romans left. The Roman occupation ended in Britain, and that marked the arrival of Anglo-Saxons, who were pagans, and the Christian religion went underground in England for a period of time. The Christians then in England were obviously then fusing with some Anglo-Saxon traditions that had significant cultural ramifications for English history and English identity. So the Anglo-Saxons had a very individualistic society. They had arrived from outside of the Roman Empire. So they had never been influenced by the Roman way of thinking, the Roman laws that had come into Britain under the Roman occupation. So this way of thinking is actually quite different to what existed under Roman occupation, and indeed amongst the Celtic tribes that inhabited Britain at the time. This point about the individualistic culture of the Anglo-Saxons is very important, because they elected their leaders, their kings. There was less nepotism than you might find in tribal or clannish-based systems that existed in Celtic parts of Britain. So they brought this culture of individualism over into England, and it fused quite nicely with Christianity, in the sense that Christianity was looking to sort of make everybody equal under the eyes of God. So the idea that you could fuse these ideas of political individualism and this sort of spiritual individualism was actually quite fertile ground. And it meant that a type of religion developed in England, and a type of culture developed in England, that was quite different from a large part of the rest of Europe, and indeed the Celtic parts of the British Isles. So English common law fused equality under Christianity with the idea of mercy given under the law. And this went on from this point to develop a body of law, English common law, which underpinned the real sort of freedoms and liberties that we now enjoy today. So it has a very, very long history. It arguably was sort of interrupted by the Normans in 1066 after their invasion, which reintroduced forms of Roman law and ideas of absolute governance by the king, which was anathema to the English culture, which was already pretty well established by this time. So if we just wind back a little bit, the English state had been created in 927. The Norman invasion was 1066. So we've got 150 years of a functioning, united English state, during which time, the rule of law developed into a relatively sophisticated format. And this then was sort of then reignited under Magna Carta, which was first signed in 1215. Again, its main architect was Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, Stephen Langton, who believed that a proper godly Christian society wasn't ruled by a king. What was needed was a society of free people where everybody was treated equally. And only when you had those rights and forms of institutions that protected those rights could you have a properly functioning godly society which was prosperous and ensured fairness across all people. England came under the Catholic Church, and there was a body of dissenting opinion that existed from the early 14th century that criticised some of the practices and doctrines of the Catholic Church. They were called the Lollards in England. They were a national movement, but not particularly coordinated in any sense. But they had adherents, both radicals and academics, who produced documentations and research into issues of concerns they had about the Catholic Church. And that sort of was the underpinning for the Protestant Reformation that happened in England at the time of Henry VIII. Now, the trigger for that was the fact that Henry VIII was married to his brother's widow. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, and together they had a daughter, Mary. But Henry was keen for a divorce. Documents and manuscripts were being popularised amongst Protestant communities in England, probably led by Martin Luther, who's famous for his criticism of the sale of indulgences. All this information was going into places, academic places, particularly Oxford and Cambridge, or particularly Cambridge in England. And an academic body of scholars there, created the conditions for a Protestant church to be established in England. There was a series of parliamentary acts that resulted finally in the break from Rome in 1534. Schools of opinion developed around more pro-Catholic groups, traditionalist groups who wanted to keep much of the Catholic ceremonies, and the more radical groups, the Puritans, who wanted as much reform as possible, not complete reform, of the Church of England. These two groups split, have always remained split, but largely accommodated within the Church of England for a number of centuries. Some of those on the more radical side broke out of the Church in the 17th century, forming their own separate churches, independent churches. Scotland indeed formed its own Presbyterian church, and there was calls for a national Presbyterian church in England as well around this time. But the Church of England becomes interesting and key to national identity because it is there as a national church. It's there to sort of accommodate as many people as possible, and it covers a wide opinion and also allows for a good degree of toleration between those different views. It still exists today. We have high churches that are Anglo-Catholic, low churches that are more evangelical. So that tradition has always been there. But importantly, there's always been this unifying church that helps establish an identity for the people of England.